December 1944, the Ardennes. Before first light, the forest is silent in the way only a battlefield can be silent, not peaceful, just waiting. Snow clings to fir branches. Frost grips the ground in a pale crust over mud, shell holes, and broken gear. Somewhere far off, artillery moves like distant thunder, slow and deliberate, rolling through the hills before the sound dies into the trees. A German patrol picks its way past the remains of an American position. A helmet lies half buried in the snow. A torn wool glove hangs from a branch. A shallow foxhole has caved in on one side, as if the earth itself tried to close over the night's violence. One of the soldiers crouches near the edge and sees something under the drift. Canvas. Olive drab, a strap frozen stiff. He pulls it free. It is an ammunition bag, but not like the pouches he knows. Not leather, not stiff, not built around the rhythm of a bolt-action rifle. Inside are loaded clips, cleanly packed, organized for speed. Cardboard dividers, markings from factories far away. Ammunition prepared not merely to be carried, but to be used fast. The soldier turns one clip over in his glove. A small thing, almost ordinary. But out here in the white cold of the Ardennes, that little bag carries the shape of a much larger war, a war of assembly lines, convoy routes, port cranes depots, standardization, and a kind of industrial confidence Germany has spent years trying to outfight. Before this winter battle is over, that difference will matter more than any one patrol yet understands. To understand why an American ammunition bag could look so strange to German soldiers in late 1944, you have to begin far from the forest, far from the snow, far from the foxhole. You have to begin with the war before the battle. The American army that entered Western Europe in 1944 did not arrive suddenly. It was built, staged, fed into motion over years. Before a single American infantryman fired a rifle in Normandy, the Allies had turned Britain into a vast armed waiting room. Camps spread across the countryside, airfields multiplied, warehouses filled. Port facilities strained under the weight of a continental invasion, being assembled piece by piece. Men crossed the Atlantic in huge numbers. So did trucks, fuel, guns, radios, rations, bridging equipment, spare parts, bulldozers, artillery shells, and mountains of small arms ammunition. This was not the glamorous side of war. It was paperwork and rail coordination. It was stevedores and depot clerks. It was ships arriving on schedules measured in tonnage and risk. But this was the hidden architecture of Allied power in Europe. One official history of U.S. logistics later described the conflict in Europe in exactly the terms German soldiers would come to fear most, as a materiel battle. By February 1944, the American presence in the European theater had grown to more than 1 million troops. Between May 1943 and May 1944, British ports handled over 5 million measurement tons of supplies and 6 million personnel for the coming campaign. By the end of June 1944, after the Normandy landings, over 452,000 troops, 70,000 vehicles, and 289,000 tons of cargo had arrived over the beaches. Those numbers do not feel dramatic on their own, but numbers become drama when they are translated into battlefield reality. Every vehicle unloaded in Britain, every case of ammunition stacked in a depot, every spare rifle part, every truck tire, every gallon of fuel. It all existed for one purpose, to make sure that when the front opened, it could keep moving. That system shaped the individual soldier more than he often realized. The American infantryman who landed in France did not just carry a rifle. He carried the assumptions of the system behind him. He expected ammunition to come in standard loads. He expected spare parts to exist somewhere to the rear. He expected artillery support to be reachable. He expected that if his unit took losses, replacements, not always enough, not always on time, but replacements, would eventually appear. In 1944, these expectations were not arrogance. They were doctrine hardened into habit. And no American battlefield object symbolized that doctrine more clearly than the M1 Garand. The U.S. Army adopted John C. Garand's semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon on 9 January 1936. The Ordnance Corps later described it plainly. Garand's invention was the first semi-automatic shoulder rifle adopted as the standard infantry weapon by a major world power, and it gave the U.S. soldier a firepower advantage during World War II. That advantage came from the rifle's rhythm. A German infantryman with a carabiner 98 Kai worked a bolt between shots. The weapon was reliable, accurate, familiar, but each round demanded a movement of the hand and body before the next. The M1 Garand changed that tempo. 8 rounds sat in an en-bloc clip. The rifle cycled itself after each shot. A soldier still had to aim, breathe, decide, and endure. But the mechanics between one shot and the next were faster. In a hedgerow, in a village street, in a forest stand, in the brief violent exchange where exposure lasted only a second, that difference mattered. The Garand did not fight alone. It demanded a support logic. A rifle that fires faster needs ammunition arranged for speed, not merely storage. American web gear reflected this. Documentation on wartime Garand cartridge belts notes that the U.S. Mr. 1910 and M1923 cartridge belts could hold Garand clips, with each pocket holding one 8-round Garand clip or 2 5-round stripper clips for earlier rifles. Again, this sounds like a small detail. It was not. It meant that ammunition was physically organized around rapid use, around the hand, around contact, around the assumption that the ordinary rifleman, not only a machine gun crew, would produce serious firepower on his own. So when German soldiers later found American ammunition gear, they were not just looking at another army's supplies. They were looking at another army's philosophy. And that philosophy was now crossing the channel in vast quantities, one truckload, one convoy, and one soldier at a time. Which is why the strange canvas bag in the snow was never really a small object at all. It was the front edge of an entire industrial world. When Allied troops came ashore in Normandy on 6 June 1944, the hardest part was not simply landing, it was sustaining the landing long enough to break out. The Germans fought stubbornly in the Bocage country. Movement was slow. Casualties were real. The image of rapid liberation came later. First came the hedgerows, the traffic, the uncertainty, and the daily grind of building a beachhead that could support more than survival. Then, the line broke. Once the Allies burst out of Normandy in late July, the campaign changed speed almost overnight. What had been a grinding, attritional struggle became a race across France. The Germans retreated. The Allies advanced faster than many planners had dared expect. And suddenly, victory created its own crisis. The armies were moving so quickly that supplies struggled to keep up. Railways in France had been wrecked by Allied bombing before D-Day to limit German reinforcement. That decision had been necessary. It also meant that the advancing Allied armies could not immediately rely on the same rail network to feed themselves. Roads became lifelines, trucks became strategy. This is where the Red Ball Express entered the war. Official U.S. Army transportation history records that the Red Ball Express operated from 25 August to 16 November 1944, lasting 82 days. During that time it moved 423 tons of supplies. At its peak, as many as 140 truck companies were assigned. On 29 August alone, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles carried 12,332 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles carried 12,000. Approximately 73% of truck companies in the motor transport service in the European theater were African American, making black soldiers indispensable to the sustainment of the Western advance. That road system mattered to the foxhole in our story, because the ammunition bag a German patrolman finds in December did not begin in that forest. It began in a factory, it moved into military packaging, it crossed an ocean, it entered depots. It was hauled by truck. It was issued again and again through a chain of organization too large for any one infantryman to see whole. Somewhere in that chain may have been a black truck driver running through rain and darkness on little sleep, hauling ammunition for men he would never meet to positions he would never see. By the time the kip reached a cold American rifleman in the Ardennes, it had already lived several lives. And yet, even as Allied armies surged forward, the war in the West was not over. German leaders understood that the front had become dangerous in a new way. They were no longer merely defending ground. They were being pressed back by an enemy whose power increased with movement rather than weakening from it. Hitler's answer was not a strategic retreat. It was one final attempt to reverse the campaign with shock. The Ardennes Offensive, launched on 16 December 1944, aimed to rupture Allied lines in a thinly held sector, split Anglo-American forces, seize critical road networks, and sever overstretched supply lines before Allied material superiority could crush Germany completely. U.S. Debau's Army campaign history describes the operation as a maneuver intended to cut northern Allied supply lines and encircle and destroy a large portion of Allied ground forces. It was a desperate plan. But desperation can still be dangerous. The opening blow in the Ardennes was severe. American units in that sector were not uniformly green or careless, but the front was thin, the terrain difficult, and the weather poor. The Germans used artillery, infiltration, and armor to smash into a region considered relatively quiet. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, reinforcements, engineers, MPs, ambulances, and terrified civilians. Patrols vanished in woods. Headquarters vanished in woods. Headquarters lost contact. Positions were bypassed, surrounded, or obliterated. In those first days, German soldiers overran American dumps, aid posts, gun positions, abandoned vehicles, and hastily deserted foxholes. And here, at last, the little ammunition bag enters the center of the story. Because in the chaos of sudden winter battle, battlefield debris becomes evidence, not just of panic or loss, of systems. A German soldier opening an American ammo bag in the Ardennes is not merely discovering cartridges. He is discovering how the Americans expected a fight to unfold. He sees preloaded clips meant to go straight into a semi-automatic rifle. He sees ammunition organized for immediate use. He sees standardization, readiness, the comfort of supply translated into something a man can carry on his shoulder. And perhaps, for the first time, the deeper meaning begins to register. This is not just a rich army. This is an army that has learned how to convert industrial scale into battlefield speed. That understanding, cold, practical, almost mechanical, was about to collide with one of the most brutal winter offensives of the war. First, the human angle. By late 1944, the American infantryman in Europe had become a creature of accumulation, not comfort. Accumulation, months of marching, muds, losses, replacements, weather, fear. He carried more than equipment. He carried habit. He knew what it meant to reload in the dark. He knew how quickly gloves grew wet and useless. He knew the sickening likeness of an empty bandage pouch and the equally sickening relief of a full ammunition load before a patrol or defense line. The ammunition bag meant something intimate to him. It meant a few more minutes of confidence, a few more clips before someone had to crawl back to the rear, a few more bursts of aimed fire when the line began to shake. That is why battlefield relics can feel strangely personal. To a museum visitor, the bag is gear. To the man who carried it, it was time. Now the tactical angle. German infantry doctrine centered heavily on the machine gun as the core of squad firepower. The rifle supported the machine gun. The American squad distributed more firepower to the individual rifleman because its standard rifle was semi-automatic. That did not make the American squad automatically superior in every terrain or situation. German infantry remained dangerous, disciplined, and tactically skilled. But it did mean that in brief encounters, woods, hedges, village alleys, broken slopes, an American line of ordinary riflemen could suddenly generate a more aggressive volume of fire than older European assumptions expected. The M1 Garand was central to that reality. Its adoption in 1936 had given the United States something rare in war, a technological improvement that was not confined to elite units. It was given to the regular infantryman, and the U.S. Army later acknowledged exactly that. Garand's design gave the American soldier a firepower advantage in World War II. Now the technological angle. Weapons are never just metal. They are systems of time. A bolt-action rifle consumes time one way. A semi-automatic rifle consumes it another. The Garand reduced delay between shots, but that advantage only existed if the ammunition could be carried and fed efficiently. That is why the clip mattered. That is why the web gear mattered. That is why the bag mattered. Documentation on Garand cartridge belts shows a simple truth. The carrying system was aligned with the weapon's feeding system. Each pocket could hold one 8-round Garand clip. That sounds mundane. In battle, it is not mundane at all. It means no translation between container and weapon, no unnecessary handling, no extra step between reaching and loading. When German soldiers found such gear, they were not seeing waste. They were seeing a supply design built to save seconds, and in infantry combat, seconds are blood. Now the German perspective. A German soldier in late 1944 was often living inside contraction, shortages, improvisation, reissued equipment, worn transport, diminishing fuel, reduced training standards in many formations, older habits adapted to harsher limits. He could certainly understand enemy ammunition and captured gear. What may have struck him was not mystery in the narrow sense, but logic in the broader one. Why this kind of cloth packing? Why preloaded clips in this quantity? Why gear built around immediate access rather than conservative economy? Because the American army could afford to think of time differently. And that difference is what the bag really contained. Not only rounds, tempo. The logistical angle goes deeper than any weapon comparison. One of the most famous remarks in the European War came from a captured German soldier who marched past the immense Allied supply dumps in Normandy, said, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." It is one of the clearest battlefield verdicts ever spoken by the losing side. That sentence explains the ammunition bag better than any technical manual. The bag is not impressive by itself, but multiplied by 1,000,000 and backed by ports, convoys, depots, and staff work, it becomes crushing. American power in Western Europe was not only in tanks or aircraft, it was in repeatability, in the ability to make one infantry position look much like another in the things that mattered: ammunition, rations, fuel, replacement parts, signal batteries, transport capacity. The leadership angle matters too. John Garand's rifle was not simply invented and admired. It was standardized, adopted, produced, supported. The decision to make a semi-automatic rifle the standard infantry arm before the war reflected more than good engineering. It reflected institutional willingness to trust ordinary soldiers with greater firepower and to accept the supply burden that came with it. That burden was real. A faster-firing rifle encourages greater ammunition expenditure, but America went into the war with the industrial and organizational confidence to support that choice. Germany, by contrast, entered the late war increasingly trapped between battlefield necessity and production reality. It knew the need for more automatic or semi-automatic infantry firepower, but it could not remake the whole infantry experience at scale in time. Then there is the enemy angle. To many German soldiers, fighting the Americans meant confronting an opponent often mocked early in the war as inexperienced, mechanical, or overly dependent on material. Yet that very dependence became a strength when properly organized. Americans used artillery heavily. They used radios well. They moved with trucks on a scale Germany could rarely match, and the ordinary rifleman was not underarmed. This mattered psychologically. It is one thing to believe the enemy is powerful because of tanks and planes. It is another to discover that even the dead man in the foxhole had a weapon system that let him shoot faster than expected and reload from clips already prepared for violence. Finally, the moral angle. War reduces human lives to objects with alarming speed. A glove in the snow, a boot with no foot in it, a diary page wet through, a bag of loaded clips, but objects also preserve dignity. They remind us that men prepared for tomorrow. They packed their gear believing they would need it. They arranged ammunition because they expected to still be alive when the line was hit again. That is the sadness folded into battlefield equipment. It is practical, yes, but it is also aspirational. It assumes continuity. The American bag found in the Ardennes may have belonged to a man who ran, a man who froze in place, or a man who died before he could fire the last clip. The German soldier who found it may have felt only curiosity, but history sees more. It sees one human being encountering the material trace of another, and through that trace, glimpsing the scale of the war around them both. And then the shelling begins again, and curiosity gives way to survival. At 5:30 a.m. on 16 December 1944, the Ardennes offensive began under darkness and winter weather. German artillery crashed onto American positions across a wide front. Telephone lines were cut. Forward observers lost contact. Men woke inside shock before they understood the shape of it. In some sectors, the attack came out of fog and trees with such force that confusion became the first casualty. This was Hitler's last major gamble in the West. The plan demanded surprise, speed, and road control. German armored and infantry formations were to punch through thinly held American sectors, race westward, seize key crossings, fracture Allied command cohesion, and turn tactical rupture into strategic collapse. It was a plan that depended on time as much as terrain. Every hour mattered, every road mattered, every gallon of fuel mattered. In the opening hours, the attack achieved genuine shock. Some American positions were overrun. Some units were cut off. Some roads dissolved into panicked movement. Trucks backed into ditches. Engineers scrambled to blow bridges at the last possible moment. MPs waved weapons at traffic that would not stop. Artillery batteries fought to avoid capture. Headquarters worked from rumor and fragments. This was the environment in which battlefield debris accumulated with terrifying speed. Ammunition boxes burst open in truck beds. Ration crates were abandoned at crossroads. Fuel cans rolled off trailers. Medics lost aid bags in retreat. Rifle clips ended up in the snow, not because soldiers were careless, but because the battlefield moved too fast for order. And in one half-collapsed American foxhole, a German patrolman finds that canvas bag. He opens it. Inside, loaded clips. Ordered, ready, efficient. American war compressed into a handful of steel and canvas. At first glance it may look like evidence of defeat, an abandoned position, a dropped supply, an absent owner. But a battlefield object can mean two things at once. Yes, it means the line here has broken. But it also means the line was equipped, and the German offensive, for all its violence, had a deeper problem. It was punching into an opponent whose capacity to reform was unusually strong. This is what the Germans keep discovering as the first days of the offensive unfold. At Elsenborn Ridge, American resistance hardens. At St. Vith, delays multiply. Around Bastogne, road networks become worth entire battalions, and the defense begins to stiffen into legend. Elsewhere, nameless roadblocks, engineer parties, tank destroyer detachments, artillery batteries, stragglers, cooks, plaques, and rifle companies thrown together in haste do exactly what the German plan cannot tolerate. They steal time. That is the decisive hidden function of the American soldier in the bulge. Not to remain calm everywhere. He did not. Not to hold every sector. He could not. But to keep enough places from collapsing long enough for the American system behind him to wake up and bite down. The bag in the foxhole becomes symbolic here, because those clips are not only ammunition, they are proof of expectation, proof that someone built this line to fight again, and the Germans are now discovering that even when they overrun one position, the next may already be loading. The German offensive in the Ardennes did not fail in a single theatrical moment. It failed by attrition of momentum. It failed every time a road jammed longer than planned, every time a fuel column lagged, every time a bridge was blown, every time an American unit that was supposed to dissolve instead held for 6 more hours, every time artillery stayed in action when it should have been silenced, every time weather, terrain, and traffic conspired against German timetable rather than helping it. That is why the first days were so dangerous. The plan did not need permanent superiority. It only needed enough speed before the Allied system reacted. But the reaction came, not instantly, not neatly. Yet once it began, the terms of the battle changed. American commanders shifted reserves, road discipline improved, units were reoriented, artillery concentrations deepened, defensive nodes were reinforced. Air power, initially hindered by weather, returned when the skies began to clear. German columns that had needed concealment and uninterrupted movement now found themselves increasingly exposed. And behind all of this, always, was supply. A line can only harden if it can be fed. Rifle fire can only matter if clips reach the man. Artillery can only dominate if shells keep coming. Vehicles can only reposition if fuel exists. This is where the material depth of the American army reasserted itself in the most brutal possible conditions. The same war that had poured more than 452,000 troops, 70,000 vehicles, and 289,000 tons of cargo into Normandy by the end of June was now proving it could survive a winter shock and still sustain the front. Now imagine that same German patrolman a week later. At the start, the ammo bag was curious, perhaps even reassuring, a sign that the Americans had been hit hard enough to leave gear behind. But what does he think now, after days of fighting? He has seen American artillery return, seen roadblocks appear where nothing stood before, heard semi-automatic rifle fire from hedges, tree lines, and village edges, watched attacks lose force not always because of heroics in one place, but because the enemy keeps finding a way to remain supplied. Suddenly, the little bag makes sense. It makes sense because the Americans are not improvising ammunition at the edge of battle. They are delivering prearranged speed to the edge of battle. It makes sense because the ordinary American rifleman is part of a giant supply equation. It makes sense because even his personal firepower is industrially backed. This is the moment the battle turns from offensive drama into strategic defeat. The Germans still fight, hard, sometimes brilliantly. But by late December, the offensive has spent the thing it could never replace, possibility. The great rupture does not come. The Meuse is not reached. The Allied front bends, suffers, bleeds, and then begins to close. The German army has struck a heavy blow, but not a war-winning one. And once the blow fails, Germany has traded precious armor, fuel, transport, and trained manpower for a temporary bulge on the map. The Americans, meanwhile, have paid dearly, but they have kept the system intact. In that truth lies the whole meaning of the bag in the snow. A small artifact. A large answer. When the Battle of the Bulge ended, it left behind the kind of damage winter preserves well. Burned villages, split forests, blackened road verges, frozen wrecks, ammunition crates burst apart and refrozen into mud. The dead under blankets or under snow. Every army leaves such signs. But the Bulge also left a clearer strategic verdict than Germany could afford. The offensive had failed. It inflicted severe American casualties. It caused genuine crisis. It achieved surprise, but it did not break the Western coalition, seize its decisive objectives, or reverse the war in the West. What Germany spent in that attempt, armored strength, vehicles, fuel, trained crews, operational initiative, could not truly be rebuilt. For the Americans, the battle became It is not a relic because it is rare. It is powerful because it was ordinary. Thousands like it existed. Thousands were packed, issued, dropped, lost, soaked, torn, opened in panic, opened in routine, emptied, refilled, or buried under the feet of men who never noticed history while they were making it. The same is true of the men behind it, the rifleman in the foxhole, the quartermaster who signed for the ammunition, the ordnance worker who checked the lot, the dock laborer who handled the crate, the black truck driver on a night run through France, the German patrolman in the snow, staring at a system he can feel but not stop. All of them belong to the object. That is why battlefield storytelling should be careful not to flatten war into hardware worship. Weapons matter, equipment matters, but objects only become meaningful in motion. A Garand clip matters because someone must load it. A belt matters because someone must carry it. A truck route matters because someone must drive it in rain, fatigue, and danger. A supply system matters because frightened young men at the front are gambling their lives on whether it works. In the end, the Americans did not win in Western Europe because they had one better bag, one better clip, or one better rifle. They won because all those things were joined together, and Germany by late 1944 no longer had an answer equal to that union. War often announces itself with noise. Engines, guns, explosions, orders shouted in bad weather. But history is not always loud when it reveals itself. Sometimes it is quiet. A German soldier kneels in the snow. He pulls a canvas bag from a ruined foxhole. He opens it and sees loaded American clips arranged for a rifle, the confirmation of hard-earned truths. First, that Materiel was not a supporting actor in war. It was one of the lead characters. Second, that the decision made years earlier to standardize the M1 Garand had paid off exactly where it mattered most, in the hands of the ordinary infantryman. The Ordnance Corps' later assessment that Garand's rifle gave the American soldier a firepower advantage was not institutional pride. It was battlefield fact. Third, that logistics under pressure was still logistics. The Red Ball Express had officially ended a month before the Bulge began, but its spirit did not end. The road discipline, trucking culture, depot logic, and habit of solving crisis with movement remained embedded in the campaign. The 412th 193 tons Red Ball had moved, in 82 days, were not merely cargo figures. They were proof that Allied operations in Western Europe had learned how to feed momentum. And then there was the matter of perception. German soldiers had spent months encountering evidence of American abundance, supply dumps in Normandy, endless truck traffic, artillery ammunition, fuel stocks, web gear designed for a faster-firing rifle. Captured objects told a story official communiques could no longer conceal. This was not an enemy temporarily strong. It was an enemy structurally strong. That understanding can be humiliating for a frontline soldier, not because he feels inferior, but because he begins to see that courage is no longer the only relevant currency. You may fight well, you may seize the crossroads, you may overrun the first position, and still lose to the road behind the next one. After the Ardennes, the Western War moved toward conclusion. Germany could still resist. It would, but after the failed winter offensive, the direction of the campaign was no longer in doubt. The Allies would regroup, advance to the Rhine, cross it, and move into the Reich itself. The war's final western phase belonged increasingly to the side that could maintain pressure without exhausting itself first. That is where the Wartime battle reached its full meaning. American logistics histories stress the enormous scale of build-up and sustainment in Europe. The famous captured German soldiers' remark from Normandy, "You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us," was not only a description of D-Day's aftermath, it was a description of the whole campaign's logic. The little ammunition bag from our story sits inside that logic. It fires faster than his own. He frowns, not because he cannot identify ammunition, but because the object hints at something larger than the battlefield around him. That is the real story here. Not mystery, not magic, not some secret American wonder bag, just a small practical piece of military equipment carrying inside it the full confidence of an industrial democracy at war. The bag tells him that somewhere far behind this frozen front there are factories still working, ports still unloading, officers still counting, truck drivers still moving through the night, and a system still capable of putting ammunition into another man's hands, even after lines have broken and roads have vanished under snow. That is what he could not fully make sense of at first, because by the winter of 1944, Germany was still fighting battles. America, by contrast, was fighting a whole environment of war. And in the Ardennes, in the silence between artillery barrages, one abandoned ammo bag said more about the outcome of the war than 1,000 speeches ever could.